Does America really have a godly heritage? Did you realize that 52 of the 55 founding fathers who worked on the Constitution were members of Orthodox Christian churches, and many were even evangelical Christians? We don't hear that part of our history anymore. This 1856 Maryland history textbook contains a story about George Washington that you've probably never heard. It's a story of how Washington's life hung in the balance for over 2 hours and how that only by the direct intervention of God was it spared. We'll get to this story in just a moment. This story of George Washington once appeared in virtually every student text in America, but hasn't been seen in 40 years. This story deals with George Washington when he was involved in the French and Indian War as a young man of only 23 years of age. The French and Indian War occurred 20 years before the American Revolution. It was the British against the French, and the Americans sided with the British, and most of the Indians sided with the French. Both Great Britain and France disputed each other's claims of ownership along the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. Both of them claimed the same land. Unable to settle the dispute diplomatically, Great Britain sent 2,300 hand-picked veteran British troops to America under General Edward Braddock to rout the French. The British troops arrived in Virginia, where George Washington was colonel of the Virginia militia, and he and 100 Virginia buckskins joined General Braddock. They divided their force, and General Braddock, George Washington, and 1,300 troops marched north to expel the French from Fort Duquesne, now the city of Pittsburgh. On July the 9th, 1755, only 7 miles from the fort, while marching through a wooded ravine, they walked right into an ambush. The French and Indians opened fire on them from both sides. But these were British veterans. They knew exactly what to do. The problem was they were veterans of European wars. European warfare was all in the open. One army lined up at one end of an open field, the other army lined up at the other end. They looked at each other, they took aim, and they fired. No running, no hiding. But here they were in the Pennsylvania woods with the French and Indians firing at them from both sides, from the tops of trees and from behind rocks and from under logs. Well, when they came under fire, the British troops did exactly what they'd been taught. They lined up shoulder to shoulder in the bottom of that ravine, and they were slaughtered. At the end of 2 hours, 714 of the 1,300 British and American troops had been shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians had been shot. There were 86 British and American officers involved in that battle, and at the end of the battle, George Washington was the only officer who had not been shot down off his horse. He was the only officer left on horseback. Following this resounding defeat, Washington gathered the remaining troops and they retreated back to Fort Cumberland in western Maryland. They arrived there on July the 17th, 1755, and the next day, Washington wrote a letter to his family explaining that after the battle was over, he had taken off his reversal of national policy prior to that point. It was in the Abingdon v. Shemp and Murray v. Curlett decisions on June the 17th, 1963, that the court not only reaffirmed its ban on school prayer from the previous year, but further reached out and banned school Bible reading. Recall that in the brief survey already presented, 94% of the quotes of the Founding Fathers were based either directly or indirectly on the Bible. Early textbooks quoted the Bible and used it as part of the alphabet, and earlier Supreme Courts ruled that a school must teach religion and the Bible. Therefore, on what possible basis can the 1963 court justify its ruling to stop the use of the Bible in schools? The court always explains its decision in written form. That 1963 case was no different. If you go to a law library and examine the text of that decision, you will find why the Bible had to be removed from school. In its written decision, the court noted that, quote, if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. Now that's quite a statement. The court has determined that the Bible has to come out of schools because it causes psychological damage to children. For the second time in a year, this was a case lacking both historical and legal precedent. Again, the court simply made a new announcement of policy: no more Bible reading in schools. Bible reading causes brain damage to students. The courts continued to extend the new boundary outward. In 1965, in the case Reed v. Van Hoven, the court determined that it was possible for students to pray over their lunch at school so long as no one knew they were praying. They couldn't say words or move their lips, but they could pray if no one knew about it. In 1967, in DeKalb versus Despain, the court took a 4-line nursery rhyme used by a K-5 kindergarten class and declared that nursery rhyme unconstitutional. The court explained that although the word God was not contained in this nursery rhyme, if someone were to hear the rhyme, they might think that it was talking about God, and that would be unconstitutional. This trend continued in case after case, year after year. In 1 year alone, 3 cases made the courts challenging the right of students to see copies of the 10 Commandments while at school. The Supreme Court accepted the Stone v. Graham case from Kentucky, where a copy of the 10 Commandments was hanging in the hallways of the schools. The court acknowledged that the 10 Commandments were passive displays. That is, they simply hung on the walls just like a picture of George Washington. They were not part of any class or any curriculum. They just hung there. A student could look at them if he wanted to, and if he didn't, fine. Yet notice the court's ruling under the redefined First Amendment. The court said, if the posted copies of the 10 Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible objective. That's quite a statement. You can't let kids see the 10 Commandments because if they do, they might obey them. Things like don't steal, don't kill, and that would be unconstitutional. When the court declares something unconstitutional, it is inferring that our founding fathers, the men who drafted the Constitution, would have opposed it. However, notice what James Madison, the chief architect of the Constitution, said about the 10 Commandments. He said, "We have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it. We've staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God." That which the chief architect of the Constitution considered to be the most crucial aspect of American constitutional government, the current court has declared to be unconstitutional. The entire controversy over God and religious activities and teachings in school had begun with the 22-word prayer in the Engel Vital case. That 22-word prayer, the prayer that led to the removal of all prayers from America's schools, simply said, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country." That prayer, which only acknowledged God and didn't even contain the word Jesus, was a bland prayer. It was so bland that 8 years later, when a court was discussing that prayer, it described that prayer as a, quote, "to whom it may concern" prayer. That bland prayer acknowledged God only once. That one acknowledgement of God is the same number of times that God is acknowledged in the Pledge of Allegiance and only 1/4 the number of times that God is acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence. What happened when we abandoned the use of God's principles when dealing with families? Consider the area of divorce. Statistically, the divorce rate had been steadily declining for years, yet it was unconstitutional. Since this simple prayer acknowledged God, the court went so far as to find out what percentage of the nation did believe in God. In the 1963 case, Aberdeen v. Shemp, the court reported that only 3% of the nation professed no belief in religion, no belief in God. 97% of the nation believed in God. That prayer was consistent with the beliefs of 97%. Nonetheless, the court took another first. It sided with the 3% against the 97%. This was the first time in America's history that 3% had become a majority. 3% had always been a minority, but now the philosophy of the 3% would be the philosophy under which the 97% must conduct its affairs. The 4 categories in that prayer which petitioned God's blessing were students, families, schools, and the nation. There are numbers of court cases readily available which show that until 1962-63, the courts consistently ruled using biblical principles and following biblical guidelines in all 4 of those areas. For example, in the area of families, even in 20th century divorce cases, a court explained that divorce was allowed for very few reasons, and that the reason was because the Bible allowed very few reasons. The court pointed out that it had not made the family, God had. Therefore, it didn't have a right to regulate something it had not made. The courts even went into a Bible lesson. It explained that in the beginning, God had made Adam and Eve. God made the first family, and then the court continued through a history of God's dealings with the family, concluding that since it was God who had created the family, the court would use His rules in dealing with it. The same policy not only held with the court's rulings on families, but also in the court's rulings on the nation, schools, and students as well. But in 1962-63, the Supreme Court reversed that position and announced that those rules and policies caused, quote, psychological damage. Did the court's decision to change national policy and to separate God's principles from its rulings have any effect? Let's examine each of the 4 categories, beginning with students. That which occurred with students following the removal of religious principles was perfectly predicted by George Washington in his farewell address when he said, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion." Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Washington warned that to remove religious principles would be to lose national morality. Notice the accuracy of his warning. This chart shows pregnancies for unwed girls ages 15 through 19. For decades prior to 1962-63, birth rates for unwed teen girls had remained relatively stable. However, with the court's separation of religious principles from students, birth rates for unwed girls have now increased every year since 1962-63. This chart represents pregnancies for high school girls, but even birth rates for girls 10 through 14 years old have increased 553% since the removal of religious principles. This is a strong correlation. Perhaps it's merely coincidental, but it is both complete and striking. It is further significant to note that every moral measurement which exists for students breaks violently upward with the separation of religious principles from the lives of students in 1962-63. Notice this category: sexually transmitted diseases to high school students. Notice how low sexually transmitted diseases had been. Notice the point when religious principles were prohibited. Notice a dramatic increase. The same is true for every moral measurement among youth. Again, each of these categories was showing overall declines prior to 1962-63, but with the first ever separation of religious principles from students, a violent upturn occurred on every chart and in every moral measurement. Washington was correct. The next category over which God was acknowledged in that simple prayer, and in which the courts had maintained the use of biblical principles prior to 1962, was that of our families, or our parents. What happened when we abandoned the use of God's principles when dealing with families? Consider the area of divorce. Statistically, the divorce rate had been steadily declining for years and even decades prior to 1962-63. Beginning in 1963, the divorce rate skyrocketed. Between 1963 and 1981, the number of divorces in America tripled every year. The United States has now become #1 in the world in the rate of divorce. It is again striking that every measurement related to the breakup of the family statistically skyrocketed in 1963 with the separation of biblical principles from public policy. Single-parent families are now up 140%. Single-parent families with children are now up 160%. Even family morality is dramatically different. Unmarried couples living together are now up 536%. Again, each of these categories had been stable for years prior to 1962-63, and then the dramatic increases correlate exactly to the court's rejection of those standards which had been applied to the family for 170 years previously. The third category in which God's assistance was petitioned was our schools. What happened when we barred God and His principles from our schools? The SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, is an excellent indicator. The SAT test has been in America since 1926, and in 1941 it was placed on the same scale that is still used today. Prior to 1963, there were never more than 2 consecutive years where the scores either rose or declined. But beginning in 1963, scores plummeted for 18 consecutive years. Unprecedented. Scores are now so low that the Department of Education states that this is the first time in America's history that we are graduating out a generation of students who academically know less than their parents did. The SAT test is the same test their parents used. It's been the same since 1941. Yet there is nearly an 80-point difference between the two generations. In 1962, there were only 1,000 Christian schools in the nation. But once it became obvious that things like prayer, Bible, and the Ten Commandments would be forbidden, there was a marked explosion in the number of religious and particularly Christian schools. By 1984, the number of Christian schools had burgeoned to 32,000 schools. Currently, 8.5 million students, approximately 12% of the student population, attends private religious schools. According to the board responsible for the SAT test, the scores of students from private schools are nearly 80 points higher than those from public schools, which places them at the same level of scores prior to 1962-63. For private religious schools, it's as if no change had ever occurred. But for public schools, their scores are still continuing to decline. Another indicator of the impact that religious principles and religious schools have had on American education is found in the academic cream of the crop, the nation's academic elite, the National Merit Semifinalists. These are the top 0.5% of the nation's students. Now, according to the Department of Education, 12.4% of the nation's students attend private religious schools. 87.6% attend public schools. Since 12% of the nation's students attend private religious schools should produce 12% of the nation's cream of the crop, and 88% of the nation's students in public schools should produce 88% of the nation's cream of the crop. Yet that is not what is occurring. For example, in recent testing, that little group of 12.4% of the nation's students from private religious schools was producing 39.2% of the nation's top academic scholars. That's a level 3 times larger than its size. That's a phenomenal differential. We showed these statistics to a U.S. congressman. He looked at them and stated, "That makes perfect sense to me," he said. He said, "When you're talking about private schools, you're talking about money. You're talking affluency." He said private schools ought to get better scores than public schools. We investigated to see if that would be true and found that according to the Department of Education, the average private school cost $2,200 per student, while the average public school costs $5,400 per student. Private schools, with 2/5 the funds, are proportionally turning out a percentage of academic scholars 3 times higher than public schools. But consider, what is the fundamental difference between public and private schools? It is not in the core curriculum. The curriculum is the same. The Civil War takes place the same year at both schools. Math is the same at both schools. A verb is not an adjective simply because someone transfers to a private religious school. The basic difference is that one school utilizes religious principles and one does not, which appears to make an 80-point difference on the SAT test. The final category, the 4th category, was our country. What happened in the nation when we separated religious principles from public arenas? Well, what do you think happens when you start telling students, you can't see the 10 Commandments, you might obey them? Things like don't steal and don't kill. That has to have an effect on behavior. It did. Washington, in yet another warning from his farewell address, accurately predicted what has occurred. He said, "Let it simply be asked, where is the security for life, for reputation, and for property if the sense of religious obligation desert?" The sense of religious obligations has deserted, and currently there now seems to be no security for life, for reputation, or for property. For example, consider violent crime. After having remained statistically stable for years, since the removal of religious principles in 1962, the number of violent crimes has now surpassed population growth by 794%, causing the United States to become the world's leader in violent crime. Perhaps the best explanation for this increase was given by Thomas Jefferson, who succinctly states why Christianity was the best friend to government. Jefferson explained, "The precepts of philosophy laid hold of actions only, but Jesus pushed his scrutinies into the heart of man. He erected his tribunal in the region of his thoughts, and he purified the waters at the fountainhead." Where the law says, "Don't kill," in Matthew 5, Jesus says, "Don't get angry, don't hate." Clearly, if you prevent the anger and the hate, you've prevented the murder. Where the law says, "Don't commit adultery," Jesus says, "Don't lust in your heart." If you control the lust, you've controlled the adultery. The founders pointed out that only religion could stop crime before it started, because all crime comes out of the heart, and if you can't control the heart, you can't control crime. That is why Christian principles were so valuable to government. Most of the founders expressed the same understanding. President John Adams pointed out that there was no government in the world able to make someone do what was right or able to control those who did not wish to be controlled. Adams explained, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." Then notice what he said. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." The founders believed that the Constitution would work only for people who had internal restraints and internal controls, for people who would use the Word of God as their standard. We've moved away from that, and clearly the Constitution, apart from religious principles, is not working the way it should, a fact evident on all the charts and statistics. Since 1962-63, the United States has undergone marked and dramatic statistical reversals, becoming the world's leader in the most unenviable categories. The United States is now #1 in the world in violent crime, #1 in the world in divorce, #1 in the Western world in teenage pregnancies, #1 in the world in voluntary abortions, #1 in the world in illegal drug use, and #1 in the world in illiteracy. Of all industrial nations, we have the highest illiteracy rate. A White House briefing recently reported that just 3 years ago, 700,000 students graduated from high school who, after 12 years of school, were unable to read their own diplomas. Looking at the list of categories that we now lead, Jeremiah 6:16 has some good advice. It instructs us that if we want the ways of peace, go back to the old paths. But what were the old paths? Once the Founding Fathers had declared themselves independent from Great Britain, they immediately faced the task of establishing new state governments. Prior to the Declaration, all the state governments had been British-run with British crown governors. By breaking from Great Britain, the states lost their governments. So after signing the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers returned to their home states to establish brand new state governments. Look at what the Founding Fathers, the men who had signed the documents, placed in their own state constitutions. For example, notice Delaware. The other states were very similar. Everyone appointed to public office shall say, I do profess faith in God the Father, and in the Lord Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God and blessed forevermore, and I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. This was not a requirement for seminary. It'd be wonderful if it were. This was a requirement to be a politician, a requirement set up by the Founding Fathers themselves. But notice that this requirement is consistent with the First Amendment because it did not require someone to be from one specific denomination to hold public office. It did not say you had to be a Methodist, a Lutheran, a Catholic, an Anglican, a Presbyterian, or a Baptist, but it did say that you had to understand God's principles. You had to understand the Word of God to hold office. The different state constitutions contained several common components. For example, notice the requirements in Pennsylvania and Vermont constitutions. The other states were very similar. And each member of the legislature, before he takes his seat, shall make and subscribe the following declaration. I do believe in one God, the Creator and Governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good, and the punisher of the wicked. In other words, a politician must acknowledge his understanding that when he left office, he wouldn't just answer to the voters, he would be accountable to God for what he had done while in office. He would answer to God himself. This concept of individual accountability to God is well understood. It is broadly accepted that we will answer to God in the future. The founders, however, took this principle a step further. It was clear that an individual answered to God, but did a nation also answer to God? The Founding Fathers believed that it did. On the floor of the Constitutional Convention was explained the difference between individual accountability to God and national accountability to God. An individual answers to God in the future, but not a nation. When a nation dies, it is forever dead. It will not be resurrected in the future to answer for what it has done. Therefore, when does a nation answer to God? George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, explained, as nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities. The founders believed that God would deal with a nation right now, in the present, for the stands that it takes. A nation has no other time to answer to God than the present. Perhaps this is the best explanation of why all the charts broke dramatically in 1962-63, when for the first time in the nation's history, we officially told God he was no longer welcome in the public affairs of this nation. The charts simply illustrate a principle the founders understood, believed, and discussed. Supporting examples are found throughout the Bible. For example, the story of Elijah in 1 Kings. After he won his confrontation with the prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel, he went to Mount Oreb where he complained to God, "Get me out of here. I'm the only one left. There's no one else in the nation who believes in you." And God responded, "There's 7,000 men in this nation, men of integrity, righteous men, men who do love me and who have not bowed their knee to Baal." Yet what was occurring in that nation? Ahab and Jezebel were the nation's leaders. They were wicked leaders. Because of their wickedness, because of the bad stands taken by the nation's leaders, the entire nation, including those 7,000 righteous men, went for 3.5 years with no rain. You see, God had to deal with the nation based on the stands of the nation's leaders, despite the fact that there were righteous individuals in the nation. Another example is that of David in 1 Chronicles. David decided to number his troops. He'd won so many victories that he came to the point where he thought, I win victories. I'm a strong king. I want to see how big my armies are. His general, Joab, tried to reason with him. David, don't number the troops. God is the one who wins the victories. It's not the size of your army. But David persisted. No, I want to see how big my army is. I want to know how strong I am. Go number my troops. That was a bad stand for the nation's leader to say, God, you haven't won the victories. I've won the victories. As a result of that stand by David, a plague came on the entire nation, and in Jerusalem alone, 70,000 people were wiped out in one day. You see, a nation does account and will either suffer or be blessed for the stands of its leaders. This is why the founders were so emphatic about keeping men in office who understood God's principles. And perhaps the most famous speech ever delivered by Benjamin Franklin, delivered on Thursday, June the 28th, 1787, on the floor of the Constitutional Convention, Franklin reminded the delegates that we needed God to be our friend, not our enemy. We needed him to be our ally, not our adversary. We needed to make sure that we kept, as Franklin called it, his concurring aid. Franklin warned, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, Is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? He said, we've been assured in the sacred writing that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. And thus Franklin called for regular daily prayer to make sure that we kept God in the midst of what we were doing in the nation. Jefferson too understood this principle. Jefferson declared, and can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that His justice cannot sleep forever. A nation does answer to God for the stands it takes. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, overheard someone in the White House state that he hoped that God was on our side in the battle, that God was on the Union side. Lincoln, showing that he understood the principle of national accountability, replied, "Sir, I'm not at all concerned about that, for I know that the Lord is always on the side of the right. But it is my constant anxiety and prayer that I and this nation should be on the Lord's side." This understanding of national accountability to God has been part of our heritage, part of our history. Our founders understood that a nation needed to take stands which lined up with God's principles so that God's blessings and His concurring aid, as Franklin described it, could rest on the nation. In 1774, while ambassador in France, Benjamin Franklin made a recommendation to the French which sums up what again must happen in America. Franklin stated, "He who shall introduce into public affairs the principles of primitive Christianity will change the face of the world." Franklin was saying, do you want to be a world's leader? Then put Christian principles in your public affairs. Recall Charles Finney? Finney said, the church must take right ground in regard to politics. Politics are a part of a religion in a country as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. God will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics. Why is this true? Can a nation be blessed apart from God's principles? No. But where do God's principles reside? They reside in the hearts and the lives of God's people. If God's people do not get involved, God's principles do not get involved. The ungodly will not run a nation by godly principles, and God can't bless ungodly principles. That's why the church has to take right ground. That's why the founders were so emphatic about keeping Christian men in office, an emphasis evident from the first Supreme Court justices to the individual state constitutions. Today, we cannot afford to be isolationist. We can't say, I'm not going to get involved. We must realize that we need to get involved. For God's principles do not enter any arena on their own. They enter only through God's people. Proverbs 18:1 says, "A man who isolates himself seeks his own desires. He rages against all wise judgment." The founders used to teach their young people, do you want to do something good for God? Then be a senator, be a judge, a congressman, a doctor, a lawyer, a missionary, or a pastor. But get out there where you can affect people with God's principles. But in the 1940s and the 1950s, we began to say in America, young people, do you want to do something good for God? Then be a missionary or be a pastor, but don't get involved in politics. When we started getting out, we handed the system over to ungodly principles. We've got to get involved again. We have to come to grips with the fact that separation of church and state, as we have it today, is not in the teaching of the Founding Fathers. It is not a historical teaching, and it is not a teaching of law until recent years. We also have to realize that the current version of separation of church and state is not a biblical teaching. Separation says, okay, Christians, we recognize that you're the light of the world, just don't get out of the church. Don't shine on anything outside the church. Or Christians, we recognize you're the salt of the earth, but don't get out of the shaker. You see, separation of church and state says you can be salt and you can be light, but only inside the four walls of the church. That's not scriptural. We can't do that. We further need to recognize the fact that there is going to be someone's religion in schools and in government. For example, in 1961, in the case Torcaso v. Watkins, and again in 1985, the courts ruled that secular humanism was a legitimate religion, equivalent to Christianity under the law. Secular humanism, by the court's recognition, is a viable First Amendment religion. Now, secular humanism has a religious philosophy which very simply says that God has no place in their philosophy. It is a religious philosophy based on men, not on God. The court has recognized it as a religion. In 1977, in the cases Theriault v. Silber and Malnick v. Yogi, the court said that atheism was a religion. But how can atheism be a religion if it doesn't believe in God? Whatever you believe with all of your heart, whatever affects the way that you act, whatever you believe so strongly that it changes your behavior, that is your religion. So what is the religion of atheists? The religion of atheists, The thing that affects the way they behave is that they believe with all their heart that there should be no religious practice. Therefore, the religion of atheism is the religion of practicing no religious practice. It is religiously practicing non-religion. In recent years, there have also been decisions from courts declaring satanic activities, wicks and covens and satanic groups to be a legal, organized religion equivalent to Christianity under the First Amendment. People may now give contributions to satanic groups and get the same tax deductions as people who give contributions to Christian churches. The courts consider witchcraft a religion. But consider, when do we hear separation of church and state? Have you seen anyone go into a school at Halloween and say, "Wait, get those witches down off the wall. Separation of church and state. I demand separation. Witchcraft is a legal, organized religion"? Or have you seen anyone go into public schools and say, "Now wait, I don't see any prayer here. I don't see any Bible reading here. There's no religious practice here. That means it's the religion of atheism here. I demand separation of church and state. Get the religion of atheism out"? No, we don't hear that. When do we hear separation of church and state? Anytime there's an attempt to involve Christian principles. Separation of church and state is the big club pulled out to beat back the Christians. We have lost ground in recent years as we've lost our understanding of the founders' intents and teachings. We do have a godly heritage in America, but we've been robbed by the 3%. Separation of church and state, as we have it today, is not a biblical teaching. It is not a teaching of the Founding Fathers. It is not a historical teaching, and it is not a teaching of law until recent years. The 3% has taken away our heritage. We've lost sight of it. We have to get involved and take it back. A godly heritage is the foundation of America, and the church must take right ground. We must recover the things that we've given up in recent years. We must get involved.
You've just seen one of the many outstanding videos available to you from Wall Builders. David Barton's painstaking research has produced a number of inspiring titles you don't want to miss. Education and the Founding Fathers sets the record straight by proving the revisionist wrong. Revisionists have dared to advocate that the Founding Fathers wanted an educational system free of biblical and religious influence. By relating the Founders' writings, the educational works they authored, and the laws they passed, this video carefully establishes the fact that America's early leaders upheld the Bible as a framework for American public education. In the spirit of the American Revolution, you'll find out what motivated the early patriots, men like Patrick Henry, John Adams, and George Washington, to risk their lives and fortunes in the fight for freedom. You'll learn about the lengthy prayer meeting held during the First Congress, when the Founding Fathers faced the possibility of war. The video, The Foundations of American Government, is a powerful look at how biblical principles once influenced our government. Each of these titles is available on audio cassette as well as on video. Wall Builders also offers a number of intriguing books for your library. In the updated America to Pray or Not to Pray, and in The Myth of Separation, David Barton tells how America has been sold a false doctrine to suffer for it.